They took the house on Maple Street. They took the equipment, the grain accounts, the certificates of deposit at the Cane Hollow Bank. And they left her $1, a rusted key, and a leaning silo the whole county already had a joke ready for. Daddy left the girl $1 and a tin can, her uncle said. He laughed so hard he had to set down his coffee. Nobody in that room told him to stop. But under the laugh was something they couldn't hear. A dead man's voice, already 3 years ahead of them, because Hollis Hartwell had signed something at the courthouse. Nobody else knew about it, and he'd hidden the proof inside the one thing they were mocking. She climbed that silo with a stolen ladder and a count in her head. Count the rungs, he'd written. By the 9th one, her fingers found metal that did not belong there. Wade Hartwell was already spending money from a sale he didn't know he couldn't make. $2.6 million was about to change hands, all of it on a piece of paper that was already worthless, because the land underneath it had stopped being his to sell 3 winters before he ever tried. Let me back up. Before the ladder, there was the funeral, and before the funeral, there was a lawyer named Pickett. He was reading a will in an office above a hardware store, in a town small enough that people still gave directions by a silo. $1, Wade said, wiping his eyes. Daddy left the girl $1 and a tin can. Lord rest him, he had a sense of humour at the end. Nobody told him to stop. That was the thing Della Hartwell would remember later. A room full of family let a man laugh at his own niece, and they called it grief. The lawyer's office sat above the hardware store on Polk Road in Cane Hollow, Tennessee. It was a town where the directions to anything still mentioned the leaning silo out in the bottoms. Turn left where you can see the Hartwell silo lean, folks said. And then they said it was a shame, both in the same breath. That was how Cane Hollow loved to pity a thing while it pointed at it. Pickett had a flat voice and reading glasses pushed up on his head. He read the will the way a man reads a weather report he's read 100 times. The house on Maple went to Wade, the equipment, the grain accounts, the certificates of deposit at the Cane Hollow Bank, all of it to Wade, Hollis Hartwell's only living son. A small bequest of china went to the cousins. Then, near the bottom, came the part that sent Wade reaching for his coffee. To my granddaughter Della Ruth Hartwell, the 80 acres in the Caney Fork bottoms, the structures thereon, as is, no value, valued at $1. As is, no value. Wade repeated it like he wanted to taste it. That land's a swamp with a flagpole. He'd give her the swamp. Della sat very still, in a hard chair by the window, 26 years old. Auburn hair in a braid gone loose at the temple. A coat 2 winters past warm. She did not cry. She did not argue. She would not give Wade the satisfaction of watching her face fall. She'd learned that a long time ago. Some men feed on it. So she kept her eyes level and looked at Pickett instead. There's more, Pickett said. He turned a page. Mr. Hartwell attached a note, asked it be read aloud. His words, not mine. The room went a little quieter. Wade leaned back and crossed his arms. He was ready to be amused again. Pickett read it plain, the way it was written. I didn't leave you a farm, Della. I left you the only key in this family that still opens something. Count the rungs. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Wade snorted. Count the rungs. He'd gone soft by the end, I told you all. Talking riddles to a girl about a busted grain bin. Count the rungs of what? One cousin asked. The ladder, I'd guess, Pickett said. He wouldn't explain it to me either. Said the right person wouldn't need it explained. Della felt the words settle under her ribs and stay there, warm and strange, like a hand at the back of her neck. She didn't know yet what they meant. She only knew one thing. Her grandfather never once in his life said something he hadn't measured first. A little brass-headed key sat in a paper envelope on the table. Her name was on it, in his handwriting, rusted at the bit, bright at the bow. She closed her fingers around it before Wade could joke about that too. When the meeting broke, the family swarmed the easy parts, the bank papers, the house keys. Who got the truck? Wade was already on the phone in the hall. His voice was low and fast, the voice of a man with somewhere better to be. Della caught pieces of it walking past. The word closing, the word option, the word soon. She didn't think much of it then. She'd think a great deal about it later. Pickett caught her at the door. There's the personal effects, he said, almost gentle. From the room at the home. They said, take what you want before the family does. He nodded at a cardboard box on the side table. Wade's wife was already lifting out a pocket watch, checking the back for gold. The cousins picked through a tie clip, a pen, a folded flag from a war. They took the things that weighed something on a scale. Della reached past all of it. At the bottom lay a church bulletin and a pair of work gloves worn to the shape of his hands, and under those were her grandfather's reading glasses. One lens was cracked clean across the corner. She lifted them out and held them. The crack caught the window light. "That all you want?" Wade's wife said. Not unkind, just baffled. "There's a watch here." "This is all I want," Della said. "Here is the thing the room didn't know. The thing that made the glasses worth more than the watch and the truck and the house on Maple. All stacked together." For the last 2 years of Hollis Hartwell's life, a stroke had ruled him. It took the strength from his right side and the sharpness from his eyes. And in all that time, there was exactly one car in the gravel lot of the county home every Sunday afternoon. Not Wade's, not the cousin's, hers. A rusted Corolla with a bad belt. 40 minutes each way down Polk Road. Every single week. 52 weeks a year, 2 years running. She came because his eyes had gone. A man who'd read seed catalogues his whole life couldn't read them anymore. So she read them to him. Burpee and Southern States, and the grain co-op flyer. The corn varieties and the bean prices, and the long dull columns of yield. She kept her voice steady, even the Sunday after she got laid off from the cannery. She had $11 in her account, and nothing else. And she still read. He'd lie back with his bad hand on the blanket, and his good hand tapping the rail. Once, near the end, she finished a page, and he said, "Lo," his speech thick from the stroke. "You're the only one who ever came to read me anything." You remember that? She thought he meant the catalogues. She slid the glasses into her coat pocket now and felt the warmth of having been the one who came. "Suit yourself," Wade said behind her. "Always did like the cheap things, didn't you?" He said it like a kindness. You know the type. The man who calls a thing generous at the exact moment he's taking the rest of it for himself. Cane Hollow in late February was the colour of an old nickel. Della drove the Corolla out Polk Road, past the shut feed store and the Baptist church, past the bottoms where the Caney Fork ran slow and brown between bare sycamores. The land her grandfather left her opened up on the right, 80 acres of winter-dead field and brush, and at the far edge of it, against a low grey sky, the silo leaned. It had leaned her whole life, a galvanised grain bin, gone the orange-brown of long rust, taller than the dead farmhouse beside it, tilted maybe 4 degrees off true. It was the kind of lean the county had been predicting a fall from since before she was born. Hollis Hartwell seed and grain, the side had said once, in white paint worn to ghosts. Nobody had stored a kernel of grain in it in 30 years. It was the thing they named the road by. It was the thing they pitied. She parked in the weeds and sat looking at it through the windshield. The key was warm in her fist. The cracked glasses were in her pocket. $43 was in her name. She'd counted it that morning. $43 and change, a place with the power shut off, and a name in a town that had stopped expecting anything of her. She stayed anyway. That was the part Wade would never understand. A person with nothing left will still drive 40 minutes to clean out the one thing that was his. The farmhouse was worse inside than out. The power company had cut the line in January over an unpaid balance Wade let lapse. The place was hers now. And her problem. She propped the door with a brick and worked by grey window light, sweeping mouse leavings, hauling out a rotted mattress. In a kitchen drawer she found a stack of seed catalogues, creased open to the pages she used to read him aloud. She sat down on the floor with those and didn't get up for a while. It was near dusk when she heard a truck slow on the road and stop. Then a door, the careful slam of a man who'd been slamming the same door 40 years. Then a voice at the fence. You'd be Hollis's granddaughter. The one come on Sundays. He was old, broad through the shoulders the way men get who've spent a life lifting. A feed cap on white hair, hands like cured leather on the top rail of the fence. Della came out to the porch. Della, she said. Yes, sir. Odell Pruitt. He looked past her at the silo, not at her. Ran the co-op scale floor here in the hollow 40 years. Knew your granddaddy, back when this bottom grew the best soft wheat in the county. Before the water table turned on him. He worked his jaw, saw the cars at the home. Yours was the one always there. You knew him a long time. Long enough to be confused, Pruitt said. He nodded at the silo. Slow. That's why I stopped. I've been meaning to since the funeral. There's the thing about that bin I never could make sense of, and it's been sitting in my craw. Della came down off the porch into the cold. What thing? Pruitt's eyes stayed on the leaning silo. Last 2-3 years of his life. After the stroke laid him low, Hollis paid a boy to drive him out here. Couldn't hardly walk, couldn't see to read. But he'd come out and he'd be inside that bin with a little welder and a generator. Hours at a stretch. I'd drive by and hear it going. The light of it flickering through the door seam. Welding what? That's just it. The old man shook his head slowly. No crop reason, no crop in 30 years. No crop ever again in that ground. And he knew that better than anybody. A man doesn't fix up a grain bin he'll never fill. Doesn't patch and weld inside a thing the whole county's waiting to watch fall over. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were sharp under the white brows. I asked him once, leaning on this fence right here, asked him what in the world he was building in there. You know what he told me? Della shook her head. Behind her the silo stood black against the last of the light. The wind off the bottoms found the dead corn. It found the bad seams in the farmhouse roof. And it found the tired place in her chest. All at once. He looked at me, Pruitt said, and he smiled like a man who'd put one over on somebody. And he said, building Della a door, Odell, one only she'll know how to open. The old man's leather hand tightened on the rail. Didn't make a lick of sense to me then. Figured it was the stroke talking. He paused. But you got his glasses in your pocket and that key in your hand. And you're standing here when the rest of them are home, counting his money. So maybe it weren't the stroke. Maybe he knew exactly what he was saying, and he was just waiting on the one person who'd come out here and count. The wind dropped. Out in the grey, the silo leaned the way it had leaned her whole life. Patient. Rusted. Waiting. And for the first time, Della heard her grandfather's note, not as a riddle, but as an instruction. Spoken in his measured voice across the table of the dead. Count the rungs. Mr. Pruitt, she said, would you mind coming back tomorrow? I've got a feeling I'm going to need a witness. Wouldn't miss it, Pruitt said. He touched his cap. Then he walked back to his truck. Slow. The way a man walks when he already half believes something he hasn't said out loud yet. She didn't sleep much. She lay on the front room floor in her coat. The power was off. The seed catalogues were stacked under her head for a pillow. And she said it to the dark. Count the rungs. She said it over and over. Until it stopped sounding like a riddle. Until it started sounding like a chore. Something a grandfather leaves a granddaughter. The way he'd leave her a list of what needed weeding. By first light she was standing at the base of the silo. The brass key was cold in her coat pocket. The cracked glasses were folded against her chest. And Adele Pruitt's truck was already parked in the weeds, engine ticking as it cooled. He'd come before she even asked him. He stood by the door in his feed cap, a thermos in one hand. He wasn't talking. He was just there. You don't have to do this, Della said. No, Pruitt agreed, but I watched that man weld in there 2 years running. Never once asked him to explain himself twice. A man deserves a witness who finishes the job. The silo door was sheet steel, gone stiff on its hinges. It took her shoulder twice to free it. Inside, the cold was older than the cold outside. Grey light fell through a gap at the cone of the roof. It laid a soft circle on the floor. The air smelled of rust and old grain dust. And something else. The faint sweetness of a place that had once been full and empty a long time. Pigeons shifted somewhere up in the dark, and there it was, bolted to the curved inner wall, climbing up into the gloom. The ladder. Plain steel rungs welded to 2 rails. The kind a man climbed to check the level of his crop. The kind nobody had climbed in 30 years. She put her hand on the first rung, cold enough to ache. She wiped her palm on her jeans and started up. Pruitt stood below with his neck craned back, counting under his breath. Same as her. 1, he said. 2, Della said. A pigeon broke off above her in a clap of wings. She pressed her cheek to the rail and waited for her heart to quit slamming. 3, Pruitt called up. 4, 5. The whole bin gave its long groan. She felt the lean of it in her stomach. 4 degrees. The 4 degrees the county had been waiting on her whole life. She thought, not now, please. Not with me on it. And she kept climbing. 6, 7. The dark closed up warm around her. 8. She reached up for the 9th rung and her fingers found something wrong. The other rungs had been roughed the whole way around, pitted, eaten, the same age as the wall behind them. This one was different, rough on top, smooth underneath. And behind it, where her knuckles brushed the curved steel of the wall, the metal changed. There was a seam there, a line of weld raised and even. It ran a square, maybe 2 feet on a side, the bead laid down clean and deliberate, by a hand that knew what it was doing. The rust had been let grow back over it on purpose, dusted and smeared so it would read as wool to anybody who wasn't looking. But under her fingers, the shape of it was unmistakable. A panel, a door welded shut into the side of a thing the whole county was waiting to watch fall. "Mr. Pruitt," she called down. Her voice wasn't quite steady. "There's a panel here, it's smooth, it's welded, it's not supposed to be here." Silence below her. Then Pruitt's voice came up slow. "That's it," he said. "That's the freshly welded rung I could never account for. I stood at that fence 100 times. Never once climbed up to feel it for myself. Lord God. He built it right where he said he would." She hung there in the dark, one arm hooked through the ladder. She traced the square with her gloved fingertips. Again and again. And somewhere under her ribs, that warm, strange hand from Pickett's office settled on the back of her neck again. Her grandfather's voice came up out of the rust, plain as if he were on the rung above her, building Della a door. She didn't have a tool to open it. She climbed back down, shaking. Pruitt caught her elbow at the bottom rung without being asked, steadying her. The way you steady somebody who's just found out the ground under them is not what they thought. "I've got $11 I can spend on this," Della said, once her feet were flat on the dirt floor. "I've got 43 total. I need a pry bar and a chisel." "I've got a chisel at the house," Pruitt said. "Rusted, but it'll bite. I'd rather buy my own." "This is mine to open." She looked at him. Something in her face made him nod instead of argue. They drove into Cane Hollow together, her Corolla trailing his truck. She stood in the aisle of the hardware store, right under Pickett's office, counting coins onto the counter. A flat pry bar and a cold chisel. $11 and change out of 43. The boy at the register asked if she was the Hartwell girl out in the bottoms. She said yes. He said his daddy always said that silo would kill somebody. She said it might, and she bought the tools anyway. It took her the better part of the afternoon. She wedged her hip against the rail and worked the chisel into the weld bead, seam by seam. She tapped with the heel of the pry bar, because she hadn't thought to buy a hammer. Her breath smoking. Her hands gone past cold to a dull, far-off ache. Pruitt stood below the whole time, not climbing, just calling up encouragement and holding the ladder steady with both hands. Like a man bracing a table, he laid that bead down with a bad hand, and half his sight, Pruitt called up once. "You think about that with every knock. An old man on a borrowed welder. Out here alone. For you." She thought about it with every blow, how long it must have taken him, how many afternoons the boy had driven him out and sat in the truck, while the light flickered through the door seam. The thought of it kept her going when her shoulders gave out. The weld didn't want to come. Then, near dark, a corner of the panel popped loose. The crack sent the pigeons up in a storm. She got the pry bar behind it and pulled, and the square of steel bent back on itself with a shriek of metal. Behind it was a cavity, cut into the dead space between the inner wall and the outer skin. And in the cavity, grain dust sifting down off the top of it, sat a strongbox. "You got something?" Pruitt called up. His voice had climbed a register. "I've got a box," Della said. And her own voice cracked on it. It was galvanized steel the size of a tackle box, dull grey under 30 years that were really only 3. She lifted it out two-handed, heavier than it looked. The shift of her weight set the whole silo groaning again. She didn't care. She got it down the ladder one rung at a time, hugged to her chest. Pruitt talked her down the whole way, steady, steady, almost there. She carried it out into the last grey light by the farmhouse, set it on the porch boards, and knelt over it with her heart going. There was a hasp, and the hasp took a key. She already had it. She carried it from Pickett's table in her coat pocket for 2 days. The little brass-headed key, rusted at the bit, bright at the bow. The only key in this family that still opens something. Her hands were shaking so badly she missed the hole twice. Then it slid home and turned with a small, oiled click. A click some part of her recognised, though she'd never in her life heard it before. The sound of a thing her grandfather had built to open for exactly one person. The lid came up. On top, folded once, was an envelope, and on the front of it, in that slanted, careful hand, the hand she'd watched move across 100 Sunday checks and seed orders, the hand of a man who measured every word before he set it down. There was her name, Della Ruth. Pruitt had come up onto the bottom porch step by then. He stopped there, hat still on, and he went very still himself when he saw her face. Lord God, Pruitt said quietly. He did build something. There's a letter. Her voice came out wrecked. It's got my name on it. Pruitt lowered himself down onto the top step with a grunt. His leather hands hung between his knees. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the box. And he let out a long breath through his nose. Then you best read it, girl. Out loud if you can. Seems fitting somebody read his words back, after all the ones you read him. So she opened it. The paper was a sheet off a grain ledger, the lines printed faint blue. She held it up to catch what light was left, and she read it in a voice that broke, and steadied, and broke. Della, if you are reading this, you climbed it, which means I read you right and the rest of them wrong. And that is the last good bet your old grandfather ever made. I'm sorry about the $1. I had to give Wade something to laugh at, so he wouldn't go looking. A man laughing don't dig. Now listen to me. The land in these bottoms is yours, has been yours since before you can guess. I didn't trust a will. A will is a thing they fight over at a table. So I did it the other way, the way they record at the courthouse, the way a man can't argue with. It's all in this box. The bonds are for the lean years, and they'll be lean years. But the paper underneath them is the one that matters. You hold that paper, you stand still. You let them talk, and when they're done talking, you put it on the table. Don't raise your voice. You never did. That was always your strength, and they always took it for weakness. Let them. Count the rungs, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. I was always proud of you. Grandpa. For a moment the only sound was the wind in the dead corn, and Adele Pruitt's slow breathing beside her. Then she lifted out the bundles beneath the letter. Savings bonds. Rubber banded in stacks gone soft with age. Series after series dated back 40 years. Some older than she was. 5s and 10s and 100s. Bought a few at a time off a co-op paycheck. Never cashed. Never touched. Fed into this box one quiet deposit at a time, across a working life. Pruitt took one stack and thumbed it. His jaw worked. These are real, he said. These are good. Let me count a face value on this one bundle here. He licked his thumb and went through it slow, moving his lips. This bundle alone is $1,100. Matured. There's got to be, 8-9 bundles in that box. 9, Della said, because she'd already counted them twice. The way Hope sometimes asks for a recount, even when the math doesn't change. Call it $10,000–11,000? Maybe more once we get them cashed proper. Pruitt shook his head, slow. Whole town thought he was failing. Whole town. He set the bundle down gentle, like it might bruise. He weren't failing. He was saving. For somebody. Della thought of the $11 she'd spent that morning. A pry bar and a chisel. She thought of the 32 she'd had left to her name before she opened this box. She pressed her palm flat against the cold steel of it, like she could feel the weight of $11,000 right through the metal. And underneath the bonds, flat against the bottom of the box, was one folded document. Heavy paper, an embossed county seal pressed into the corner, a recorder's stamp inked across the foot of it. She unfolded it on her knees. A warranty deed. The 80 acres in the Caney Fork bottoms, the structures on them, conveyed out of Hollis Hartwell and into the Hollis Hartwell Trust. Della Ruth Hartwell, sole beneficiary. Recorded in the office of the Register of Deeds, Cane Hollow, Tennessee. Book 212, page 9. Dated 3 years gone, while he was still alive. Still on his feet. Long before any will was ever read at any table. Pruitt leaned over and read it where she held it. Then read it again, his lips moving. Then he sat back. He took his cap off and held it in both hands, the way a man does at a graveside. I witnessed that, he said softly. I'd plumb forgot. He brought me into the courthouse one morning, 3 winters back. Said he needed an honest man to watch him sign a thing. Said he didn't trust a one of his own to do it. I signed under him. I never knew what it was. He looked at the silo, black now against a sky going deep blue, leaning patient over the bottoms, the way it had leaned all her life. It was this. The whole time, it was this. Della held the deed against her chest beside the cracked glasses, and she understood, all at once, completely. She saw the shape of what her grandfather had done. The farm Wade had thrown her like a bone was not worthless. It never had been. It had stopped being the estate's to give the day that paper went into book 212, page 9. There had been nothing in the will for Wade to hand her, because there was nothing left in Hollis Hartwell's name to leave. The land was already hers, recorded and sealed, years before the old man died. Every laugh at that table had been a laugh at a thing the laugher did not own. She thought of Wade in the hall, the phone to his ear. The word closing, the word option, the word soon. Mr. Pruitt, she said. What does it mean when a man's already sold something he doesn't have? The old man put his cap back on. He looked at her a long moment in the dark, and there was something in his face that was almost a smile, and almost a warning. It means, he said, you don't say a word to a soul. Not yet. You let him keep talking, and you wait for the table. She didn't say a word to a soul that night. She wanted to be sure the paper wasn't just true in her hands. She wanted it true in the county's book too. The kind of true that didn't depend on her. The kind that couldn't be argued out of a strongbox by a lawyer with a raised voice. So the next morning, before she'd even eaten, she drove into Cane Hollow, while she still had light and gas. And she did not go to the hardware store. She went to the squat brick building on Court Street. Register of Deeds in gold letters gone dim above the door. She stood at the counter. She asked the woman there if she could see a recorded instrument. The woman was heavy-set, named Lurleen Boyd, reading glasses on a beaded chain. Book 212, page 9. You got a property question, hun? You might want a lawyer, Lurleen said. Not unkindly. I just want to see if it's there, Della said. And if it's real. Lurleen looked at her over the glasses. At the mustard scarf, the raw hands, the auburn braid, and something in the girl's stillness made her push back from the counter. She went to the big bound volumes on their steel shelves. She came back with a heavy book. She laid it open and turned it around. And there it was, photographed and bound and stamped into the permanent record of Cane Hollow, Tennessee, 3 winters gone. Warranty deed. Hollis Hartwell to the Hollis Hartwell Trust. Della Ruth Hartwell, sole beneficiary. The legal description of 80 acres in the Caney Fork bottoms. The recorder's stamp. The date. And down in the corner, in the witness line, in a cramped, careful hand, one name. Odell Pruitt. Well, Lurleen said softly, reading it upside down out of long habit. That's about as recorded as a thing can get. She looked up. You're Hollis's granddaughter. Yes, ma'am. He came in here himself to file this. I remember it. Walked in on a cane with that old man Pruitt holding his elbow. Stood right where you're standing. Made me read every line back to him out loud because his eyes were gone. Lurleen took the beaded glasses off and let them drop on their chain. He said, You read it slow now. I want to know it's right. And I read it slow. And he nodded at every line like he was checking it off in his head. She shook her head. I always wondered why a man that far gone in the eyes would care so much about a piece of bottom land. Folks said he was failing. He wasn't failing, Della said, and her voice didn't break this time. He was building a door. She asked Lurleen for a certified copy. Lurleen made one off the bound book. She pressed the county seal into it. She stamped it. She signed across the stamp. She charged Della $2. Della laid the coins down off the bottom of the $30-some she had left. And she took the heavy paper out into the grey morning. She sat in the Corolla in front of the courthouse, and she read it 4 times. The thing about the recorded copy, she understood now, was that it didn't depend on her. It didn't depend on the box under the floor, or the strong box, or even the deed itself sitting out at the farm. It was in the book on Court Street. It had been in the book on Court Street since before her grandfather died. There was no will, no lawyer, no laughing uncle who could reach into book 212 and tear out page 9. Her grandfather hadn't hidden the deed because hiding it made it strong. He'd recorded it where no one could touch it. And then he'd hidden a copy in the silo, behind the 9th rung, as a message, to the one person who'd ever climb up and find it. The hiding place wasn't a vault, It was a letter. It said, "I knew it would be you." She drove out to Pruitt's place before she went home. A tidy white house on the edge of town, a tractor under a carport, a wind chime made of old ploughshares by the door. She sat at his kitchen table. She laid the certified copy in front of him, next to a cup of coffee his wife poured without being asked. And she told him everything she hadn't said the night before, the whole shape of it, laid out plain. Pruitt put his glasses on and read the copy slow, his lips moving. And when he got to the witness line and saw his own name, his old face did something complicated. He had to take the glasses off and pinch the bridge of his nose. "He brought me in here," Pruitt said, "and never told me what I was witnessing. Just said, 'Odell, sign where the lady points. You're watching me do a thing I'm of sound mind to do.' And I signed, and I never asked, because Hollis Hartwell wasn't a man you asked." He set the copy down very gently, the way you'd set down something that might break. He played us all, the whole county. Let everybody believe he was a poor old failing fool, so the one snake in his own house wouldn't smell what he was sitting on. He looked at her, and there was something new in his face now. Not surprise anymore, something closer to worry. "You know what your uncle's already done, don't you?" Pruitt said. "You understand it. Tell me I've heard things at the feed store. Man can't help hearing things, when he's sat on a stool there 40 years. Pruitt turned his coffee cup slow in its saucer. "The way Della's grandfather used to. Wade's feed supply venture went under 2 years back. Owes the bank on a balloon note that's coming due. I guess inside 60 days. Maybe less. He's been telling people around town he's got money coming. A big number. I didn't know from where. Till you showed me this deed just now." He tapped the certified copy once, hard with one finger. A developer don't put cash in a man's hand for a handshake, Della. They put a date in front of him and a payout behind it. And a man like Wade, who's already got debts, who's always had debts, he takes that future money and he spends it now. He borrows against it. He's been covering his own holes with money from a sale that was never his to make, because the land wasn't the estate's to begin with. Della turned the coffee cup in its saucer too, the same slow way. Without meaning to copy him, "If that closing doesn't happen," she said, "that payout doesn't come. And if that payout doesn't come, every dollar Wade's already spent comes due. And there's nothing under it. Nothing." Pruitt's voice was quiet and even, and terrible. "He's a dead man walking around in a penny-coloured truck. And he doesn't even know it, because the only person who can stop him is sitting at my kitchen table, with a certified deed in her coat pocket, letting him laugh. He doesn't know I have it." "No," Pruitt agreed, "and that is the only advantage you've got in this whole county. So you keep it. You don't wave that paper at him in his own yard. You wait for the table. A man like Wade, he'll come to you. He'll have to. He needs your signature on something. Or he thinks he does. And men like that always show their hand trying to get a signature." She drove back out to the farm in the last of the daylight, the certified copy folded flat against the cracked glasses in her breast pocket. She put the box back under the floorboard, where her grandfather had once kept his good boots. And she went on cleaning out the farmhouse, like a woman who'd been given nothing but $1 and a lean-to die in. That was the hard part. Pruitt had told her at his door before she left, leaning against the frame, his hat back on his head. The hard part isn't the climbing, girl. The hard part is the waiting with it in your pocket, while they laugh. You let them laugh. A laughing man doesn't dig, so she let them. Wade came out to the bottoms himself on the 3rd day. He'd never once done that in her whole life. She heard the diesel of his truck before she saw it. A big crew cab thing, the colour of a new penny, rolling slow up the Polk Road washboard. A second vehicle behind it. A silver sedan with rental plates. A man inside it in a town coat. Della was on the porch with a bucket and a brush, her braid pinned up under the mustard scarf, her hands raw from lye water. She didn't stop scrubbing when the trucks pulled into the yard. She'd learned that from her grandfather, without ever knowing she was learning it. You let them come to you. You keep your hands moving. "There she is," Wade called out, swinging down from the cab with his arms wide, like a man greeting a daughter. And the falseness of it sat on the cold air like a smell. "There's my girl. Lord, Della, look at you. You're going to work yourself to death out here for nothing." He came up to the bottom of the steps and stopped. The man in the town coat got out of the sedan, slow. He stood by his door with a leather folio under his arm. He didn't come closer. "I want you to meet somebody," Wade said. "This here's Mr. Reardon. He's with a development group out of Nashville. Real good people. And Della, honey, they've got an offer for this place that is going to change your life." She set the brush in the bucket. She wiped her hands on her jeans and stood. An offer. A generous offer. Wade climbed one step and lowered his voice. "The way a man does when he wants you to feel let in on something. Now I know Daddy left you this place, and I know it doesn't look like much. It's leaning. The roof's shot. That silo out there's a lawsuit waiting to fall on somebody. But these folks see something in the bottoms, the river frontage, the road access, and they are willing to pay you cash money to take it off your hands, take you out of all this." He gestured at the peeling porch, the dead corn, the grey sky, the whole tired place. You could go back to the city with more money than you ever seen. Start over. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't Daddy have wanted that for you? She looked at Reardon by the car. The agent had a patient, slightly bored expression, the look of a man who'd bought 100 sad farms off 100 grieving families and expected this to take 20 minutes. But there was a thing in his face too, a small pinch of trouble around the eyes, and she remembered what Pruitt had said. The cloud on the title, the one the agent was probably already grumbling about somewhere behind the scenes, and Wade waving it away. "What's the offer?" she said. Wade told her a number, $2,600,000. It was a number larger than any she'd held in her life, large enough that for one honest beat, her broken, frightened heart leapt at it. Then she put her hand on that leap and held it still. She thought of the $11,000 of bonds under the floor. She thought of the deed under the bonds. She thought of $2.6 million of river bottom that this man in the penny-coloured truck did not own and had already spent. "That's a lot of money," she said. "It's life-changing money. It is." She picked the brush back up. "I'll have to think on it." The smile on Wade's face didn't move, but something behind it did. A flicker. The first cold draft through a door he'd thought was shut. Now Della. "Honey, there ain't a lot of time to think. These things, they've got windows. Mr. Reardon's people have got a closing date set, a whole lot of money lined up behind it. And if we miss it, that offer goes away. And you're left out here with $1 and a silo. You don't want that. I don't want that for you." He came up another step, close now, and she could smell coffee and aftershave. And underneath it, the sour edge of a man who hadn't been sleeping. "I'm trying to look out for you. I'm the only one in this family who is. Now I had my lawyer draw up the papers already. Real simple. Just your signature, and we can have you paid out by the end of the month. Friday week, we'll do it at the house in town. The big table. All proper. You just come and sign, and it's done. Friday week. The big table. The same table she'd sat at while he laughed until he had to set down his coffee. "All right," Della said. Wade blinked. "All right. Friday week. At the house. I'll come." She dipped the brush. "I'll sign what needs signing." And there it was on his face. The relief. Ugly and enormous and badly hidden. The relief of a drowning man who feels a rope. He laughed too loud. He slapped the porch rail. "That's my girl. That's smart. That's the smartest thing you ever did, Della. I mean that." He was already backing down the steps, already turning, already pulling his phone out of his coat. "Reardon, we're on. Friday week. I told you she'd see sense." The agent nodded. He got back in his silver car without ever saying a word to her. The trouble was still pinched around his eyes. The two vehicles turned around in her dead yard and rolled back out the Polk Road. Della stood on the porch with the brush dripping down her wrist. She watched them go. She didn't smile until they were out of sight. Then she went inside. She lifted the floorboard. She looked at the box for a long time. The week that followed was the longest of her life. It was also the most ordinary. She came to understand those two things could sit right on top of each other, without cancelling out. Mornings she scrubbed. Afternoons she hauled brush off the fence lines with a borrowed trailer hitch. A farm with no crop in 30 years still had 30 years of deadfall in it. Nobody was going to clear it for her. She ate crackers some nights and eggs other nights. She kept an exact tally, in a spiral notebook, the way her grandfather had once kept his yield columns. A woman with $9.40 to her name after the courthouse fees learns fast. Not counting is a luxury. On the fourth day, a padded envelope showed up in the rusted mailbox at the end of the drive. No return address. Only her name printed in careful block letters. Inside was $200 in worn 20s, and a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. It read simply, "For groceries and gas. Your grandfather fed my family 2 winters running when the mill laid us off and never once mentioned it to a soul. Somebody ought to look after his girl the way he looked after mine." She sat on the porch steps with the money in her lap. She cried for the first time since the will reading. Not from grief this time. It was that strange, bottomless feeling of finding out a dead man's kindness had outrun him. It was still moving through the county, like water finding low ground, touching people she'd never meet. She didn't spend all of it. She spent $40 on gas and groceries. The rest went into an envelope of her own, tucked behind the letter in the strongbox. Some money you don't touch. Some money you keep as proof. Pruitt came by most evenings. He never asked. He always found some reason. A fence post that needed checking. A tool he thought she might want back. He brought his wife once. A small, quiet woman named Faye. She took one look at the gutted kitchen. Then she started making a list out loud. What a body you needed to cook in a house with the power still off. She came back 2 days later with a camp stove and a case of canned soup. She wouldn't hear a word about paying her back. He'd have done the same for anybody, Faye said when Della tried. Man drove 80 miles a round trip every week to read to an old blind fool nobody else would visit. Odell talked about you for 2 years before he ever met you. Least we can do is keep you fed while you finish what he started. On the 6th day, Della drove into town. She stood in the county clerk's records room for 2 hours, with Lurlene's help. They pulled the deed of trust for Wade's failed feed supply company. A public filing anybody could ask for, if they knew to ask. The numbers were worse than Pruitt had guessed. Wade owed the Cane Hollow Bank $194,000. The note had already been extended twice. A final balloon payment of $81,000 was due in 51 days. He'd also taken a private loan against the pending sale of the bottoms, a bridge loan from a Nashville lender for $120,000. It was secured by nothing but Reardon's letter of intent and a signature swearing clear title. He's borrowed against dirt he doesn't own, Lurleen said. She read the filing over her glasses, shaking her head slow. I've seen men do foolish things in this office. I don't know as I've seen one hang himself quite this neat before. Della copied the figures into her spiral notebook, under the yield columns her grandfather used to keep. For the first time, she let herself feel something close to pity for Wade. A thin, cold pity. The kind you feel for a man standing on ice he doesn't know is cracking. She thought about warning him. She thought about it the whole drive home. The Corolla rattled over the washboard. The silo rose up grey and patient at the end of the road. Then she thought about the pocket watch. Her cousin had checked it for gold weight before her grandfather was even cold in the ground. She thought about the word cheap, said like a kindness. And she kept driving. On the 7th day, Pruitt drove her to the Cane Hollow Bank himself. He sat beside her in the lobby. A teller named Marjorie Combs ran the bond series numbers one at a time through her computer. She was a stout woman who had worked the same window for 22 years. She checked maturity dates against a chart taped beside her monitor. It took the better part of an hour. Della sat with her hands folded in her lap. She watched Marjorie's face for some sign of what was coming. It was the same way she'd once watched Pruitt's face on the porch step for a sign of what he'd found. 9 bundles, Marjorie said finally. She slid a printed summary across the counter. Series E and Series EE both, going back to the 60s on a couple of these. All matured, all still redeemable at face plus accrued interest. She tapped the total at the bottom of the page with one finger. It was the way Reardon would later tap a different piece of paper at a different table. For a very different reason. Total redemption value, near as I can figure with the tables we've got. $14,160 and change. Della stared at the number until it stopped looking like a number. It started looking like something closer to a sentence her grandfather had spent 40 years writing, one bond purchase at a time, off a co-op paycheck that had never once been generous. That's more than the whole estate paid Wade in the equipment sale last month, Pruitt said quietly. He was doing the arithmetic out loud, the way he always seemed to. Man got the house, the tractor, the grain accounts, sold off half of it already for cash. And it still didn't come to what an old blind man saved a few dollars at a time in secret. He wasn't trying to beat Wade's number, Della said. She folded the summary carefully into her coat beside the certified deed. He was just trying to make sure I'd never have to stand in a bank lobby wondering how I was going to eat next month. Looks like he managed it. Marjorie cashed the first bundle for her on the spot. $1,100 and change. It was the same bundle Pruitt had thumbed and guessed at correctly on the porch steps. Della walked out of the Cane Hollow Bank for the first time in her adult life, with more than $100 to her name, and for once she did not feel the need to count it twice on the drive home. She stopped at the grocery on the way back into the Bottoms. She bought real coffee for the first time since the will reading, and a bag of feed corn, for no reason she could fully explain. The smell of it in the truck bed reminded her of Sunday afternoons, in a room at the county home, an old man's good hand tapping the rail while she read him the co-op prices, column by column. She figured he would have appreciated the extravagance. $14,000 bought a person the right to a few extravagances, and coffee that didn't come from the bottom of a canister felt, that particular afternoon, like the largest one she could imagine. She drank the first cup standing at the kitchen counter. She watched the light bulb she'd bought with bond money burn steady overhead. Maybe this was the whole of what winning looked like. A warm cup, a lit room, nobody left to laugh at her across a table. She thought she'd have happily called it enough, even before anything else came. By the 9th day, the farmhouse had power again. A small miracle bought with 40 of Pruitt's borrowed dollars, and a promise to pay the deposit back once the bonds cleared. Della sat under an actual light bulb for the first time since she'd arrived. She read her grandfather's letter over one more time before she folded it back into its envelope. Then she locked it in the strongbox with the deed and the $200 she hadn't spent. She read the line about not raising her voice 3 separate times. She said it out loud once, testing how it sat in her own mouth. Don't raise your voice. You never did. She practiced being still. It was harder than the ladder had been. Friday week came in cold and bright, the kind of hard blue morning that makes a fading town look briefly worth keeping. Della woke before the light in the farmhouse. She dressed by the window with the power finally on. She braided her auburn hair down slow, the way her grandmother had taught her grandfather to like it. She put on the mustard scarf. She put the cracked reading glasses in the breast pocket of her coat. The folded certified copy went in the inner pocket, against her ribs. She did not eat because her stomach would not hold it. She stood a minute in the front room, where the floorboard was. Then she went out to the Corolla and drove the Polk Road into Cane Hollow. The heater rattled. The silo shrank in her mirror, leaning out over the bottoms like an old man watching a child go off to do a hard thing. The Hartwell house in town sat back off Court Street, behind an iron fence and 2 bare crepe myrtles, white columned. It was the house her grandfather had built when the co-op was good, and the bottoms ran in corn. Wade had taken it the way he'd taken everything, by being the one standing closest when the music stopped. There were 3 vehicles in the drive when she pulled in: the penny-coloured truck, Reardon's silver rental, and a third, a black sedan she did not know, with a man behind the wheel doing nothing. She would understand that one later. Odell Pruitt was already on the porch in his good coat, hat in his 2 hands. He stood off to the side like a man who had not been invited and had come anyway. When he saw her get out, he set his hat on his head. He came down the steps and walked her up, not touching her, just walking even with her shoulder. At the door he said low, "You all right?" "No," she said. "Good," Pruitt said. "Means you're paying attention." Inside, the long dining table that had been her grandfather's was laid like a closing, a leather folio open at the head, a pen on a little felt stand, coffee in the good cups nobody was drinking. Reardon sat midway down with his folio and his bored town face. Beside him a younger woman with a laptop and a notary stamp at her elbow. And at the head of the table, in her grandfather's chair, sat Wade. Pressed shirt, sleeves rolled. He looked like a man at the finish of a long race he was sure he had won. "There she is," Wade said, and stood. The warmth came off him in waves now, the worst it had ever been, because the most was riding on it. "Come in, honey, come in. Sit down. You want coffee? Sit right there." He pulled out the chair at the foot of the table, opposite him, the length of the dead man's table between them. "We kept it simple. Mr. Reardon's got everything ready. We just go through it. You sign where Brenda shows you, she notarises, and the wire goes out Monday morning. You'll have your money by lunch." He smiled wide. "How's that sound?" Della sat. She set her raw hands flat on the table, one over the other. She did not reach for the pen. She did not reach for the coffee. She let the quiet go on a beat past comfortable. She'd learned that from a man who used to turn a coffee cup slow in its saucer. He'd let other men talk themselves empty. "Read it to me," she said. Wade blinked. "What's that, hun?" "Read it to me, out loud. Every line. I want to know it's right." Something moved across Reardon's face. The same pinch around the eyes she'd seen in the yard. He glanced at Wade. Wade laughed, but it landed wrong. A half beat late. "Della, honey. It's 40 pages of legal. You don't want me to—" "You read me your offer in my own yard," she said, even and quiet. "You can read me what you want me to sign." So Reardon read it. He read the recitals, the parties, the purchase price, the closing terms, the warranties of title. Della sat with her hands folded and listened to all of it. Pruitt stood behind her chair with his hat in his hands. Then Reardon got to a certain part. The seller, it said, the estate of Hollis Hartwell, by its administrator Wade Hartwell, was the lawful owner in fee simple. It named the 80 acres described in Exhibit A. Della said, "Stop there." Reardon stopped. "Read that one again." He read it again. The estate, lawful owner, fee simple. Della let it sit in the room. "Wow, Tom." Then she reached into the inner pocket of her coat, past the cracked glasses. She drew out the single folded sheet with the county seal pressed into it. She leaned forward and laid it on the table. She slid it the length of the wood, past the coffee cups, past the notary, until it came to rest in front of Reardon. He was, after all, the only one in the room being paid to read. "The estate doesn't own it," Della said. "It never did." Wade laughed. One bark. Too loud. "What is that? What is this?" "Della, what are you, book 212? Della said, not to Wade, to Reardon. Page 9. Recorded at the courthouse on Court Street 3 winters before he died. A warranty deed from Hollis Hartwell into the Hollis Hartwell Trust. Sole beneficiary, Della Ruth Hartwell. She paused. The land was conveyed out of his name while he was alive and of sound mind. It was never in the estate. There was nothing in the estate to sell. The room had gone very still. Reardon picked up the certified copy. He read it the way a man reads a thing he is afraid is true. Fast and then slow. The bored town face came apart by degrees. At the bottom, in the witness line, his eyes stopped. "Odell Pruitt," Reardon read aloud. "That's me," said Pruitt behind her chair. I watched him sign it. He had me come to the courthouse. He put that land into trust for this girl. And I witnessed it. I signed it with my own hand. Hollis Hartwell was as sound in the head that day as any man I ever knew. The eyes were gone, but the mind was iron. He let that settle. "That cloud on your title you've been grumbling about, son. That's it. That's the cloud. It was recorded before there was ever a will to argue over." Reardon set the paper down very carefully. He set it down the same way Pruitt had set it down at his own kitchen table. Then he turned to Wade, and when he spoke, his voice had lost every soft edge it had carried into the room. "Did you know about this?" That thing is not valid," Wade said. His voice had climbed. He was failing. Everybody knew he was failing. You can't take an old man half out of his mind and— "He came into the register's office himself," Della said. "On a cane, on Mr. Pruitt's arm. He made Lurleen Boyd read every line back to him out loud because he couldn't see it. He checked off every line in his head and nodded. She'll testify to that. She remembers him. People remember him, Wade. You're the only one who decided to forget what he was." "That deed predates the will by 3 years, Reardon said. He was talking to the woman with the laptop now. Fast, like a man backing out of a burning building. "Brenda, stop. Stop the file. We're not closing on land the seller doesn't own." He stood and gathered his folio. He looked at Wade the way you look at a man who's just cost you your job. You represented clear title. You represented the estate held it free. We funded against that. There are people behind this who funded against that. "Sit down," Wade said. "Sit down, Reardon. We can fix this. The girl will sign. She doesn't even understand what she's—" "She understands it fine," Pruitt said. And then the last loop closed. It was the one Della hadn't planted. She'd only half seen it in the drive over. The man in the black sedan came in through the front door without knocking. He was unhurried, grey suit, a soft leather case in his hand. He said, "Wade Hartwell?" Wade turned, and the colour went out of his face all at once. Because a developer doesn't just drive home. Not when he's put real money into a man's hand on the strength of a clean title. Not when he learns at the table that the title was never clean. Wade had borrowed against a sale that would now never happen. The money was already gone. He'd spent it on the holes in his own life. There was nothing under it. And the man in the grey suit had a name and a card and a quiet voice. He also had a great deal of paper of his own. "Marcus Feld," the man said. "I'm with the lender on your bridge note, Mr. Hartwell. We had a call scheduled for this afternoon regarding your collateral. I understand there's been a development." He looked at the room. He looked at Reardon standing with his folio half packed. He looked at the certified deed still lying on the table. And something in his face said he'd done this before. More than once. And he knew exactly how the rest of the morning would go. $120,000, secured by a letter of intent on a property you represented as free of encumbrance. That representation appears to have been false. He set his leather case on the table's edge. He didn't open it yet. He was in no hurry at all. "We'll need to discuss acceleration." Wade's mouth opened and nothing came out of it. Della did not stay to watch the rest. An old man had told her something once, leaning out of a truck with the dome light on his face. He'd said a person didn't need to stand and gloat over a thing that had already tipped. So she stood up from the foot of her grandfather's table. She took back the certified copy. It was hers, and it was the only one in this family that opened anything. She folded it back into her coat against the glasses. She nodded to Reardon, who could not meet her eyes. Then she walked out past Wade. He was no longer looking at her at all. He was looking at the man in the grey suit, and at the long ruin of his own arithmetic. Pruitt walked her out, even with her shoulder, hat back in his hands on the porch. "You didn't raise your voice once," he said. "No," Della said. "He'd have liked that." Pruitt looked off down Court Street a moment, his old jaw working. He'd have liked the whole of it, but he'd have liked that the most. The probate clerk corrected the record the following week. Della stood again at the dim gold counter. Lurleen pulled book 212. She laid the trust beside the estate file. Then she drew a line, in the careful permanent hand of the county, through the conveyance that had never been the estate's to make. And Lurleen was the sort of woman who remembered an old blind man, the one who'd made her read slow. So she did one thing more, on her own account. For years the Bottoms had stood listed in the rolls as Hartwell Estate, unimproved, no value. She struck it, and she entered the rightful owner of record, so that no clerk who came after would ever again open the book on Court Street and read that the land was worth nothing. No buyer would read it. No nephew would read it. Never again would that book say the land belonged to no one who would come. Word moved through Cane Hollow the way it always moved, fast and sideways and mostly true. By the following Sunday, the whole church parking lot had some version of it. Wade Hartwell had signed a bridge note against land he never owned. Wade Hartwell's balloon payment was still coming due at the bank, with nothing behind it now but his own name. Wade Hartwell's development deal had died at his own dining table, in front of a notary. And the girl he'd handed $1 and a tin can, she'd been the one to kill it. Marcus Feld's people didn't wait long. Within 10 days, the bridge lender filed to accelerate the note. Word came back through Pruitt, who still had his ear to the feed store stool. Wade had put the Maple Street house up as collateral of last resort. It was the same house he'd inherited outright and never once thought he'd have to spend. The Cane Hollow Bank saw a customer suddenly exposed on 2 fronts at once, so it called its own balloon early, the way banks do when they smell a thing going soft. 2 months before, Wade had stood in a lawyer's office and laughed about $1 and a tin can. Now Pruitt did the calculations on a napkin at his own kitchen table. Wade was looking at somewhere around $300,000 of debt. No sale behind it. And a house he might not keep. Della heard all of this. And to her own surprise, she felt less like celebrating than like watching weather move through. A storm she hadn't made, but one she also hadn't stopped. "You could still ruin him further if you wanted," Pruitt said one evening. He was watching her work a paintbrush along a porch rail she'd finally gotten around to. "Man's got no cushion left. One more shove and that Maple Street house goes to the bank too." "I don't want to shove him," Della said. "I want him to leave me alone. Those aren't the same thing. But I've noticed people mix them up. Your granddaddy used to say something close to that." Pruitt settled onto the step, easing his old knees down slow. Said the worst thing you could do to a man who'd wronged you was nothing at all. Said most men who do wrong are counting on you to come at them, Because then it's a fight, and a fight they know how to win. But a man who does nothing, who just stands on his own ground, that confuses them something terrible. She used the first of the cashed bonds, $4,000, matured out of the 9 bundles. She used it the way her grandfather had meant them to be used. She understood that the day she finally sat with a bank teller in Cane Hollow, she watched the number clear into an account with her name on it. It was the first time in her adult life. She put the farmhouse power on a real account instead of a borrowed deposit. She paid Pruitt back the $40 he'd fronted her. He objected. She folded the bills into his shirt pocket herself when he tried to wave her off. She bought a used water heater from the same hardware store where she'd counted out $11 in coins for a pry bar. The boy at the register rang her up. He was the same one who told her his daddy always said that silo would kill somebody. He said it quiet. Heard what you did to your uncle. Didn't think that old lean-to had it in it. It didn't, Della said. He did. Spring came slow to the bottoms, the way it always did. The caney fork ran high. The sycamores budded out grey-green before anything else woke up. Della used a second round of the bonds, $6,000 this time. She put a real roof on the farmhouse before the spring rains found every bad seam the winter one had found first. She didn't hire it out to strangers. She drove to the feed store and asked around. She found a crew of 3 men from a family 2 farms over. They'd been laid off the same month she had. She paid them $18 an hour each, cash on the day. No waiting on a check to clear, because she remembered exactly what it felt like to need money today and not in 2 weeks. You don't have to pay us same day, the oldest of the 3 told her the first Friday. He was a broad, quiet man named Curtis Vance, and he counted his envelope with some surprise. I know I don't have to, Della said. I remember $43, Mr. Vance. I remember exactly what $43 feels like on a Friday, when you don't know where the next one's coming from. Nobody around here paid it forward to me, except 2 people. And one of them's been gone 40 years and welded me a strongbox to prove it. She handed him the envelope. So take the money and don't argue with me about it. He didn't argue with her about it again. By early May, the roof was done, tight and grey-green shingled against the sky. And Della turned her attention to the thing the whole county had been waiting 30 years to watch fall. She hired a man out of Nashville with a hydraulic lift and a heavy-duty come-along. He was a specialist in writing old grain structures. It took him and 2 helpers the better part of 4 days. They jacked the footing. They trued up the 4-degree lean that had leaned her whole life. They re-anchored the base in fresh concrete. It cost $11,000. That was nearly all of what remained of the bonds once the roof and the power and the crew's wages were paid. Pruitt stood at the fence the whole 4 days, his arms crossed on the top rail. He watched the silo come slowly, groaningly upright for the first time in 3 decades. Feels wrong watching it stand up straight, Pruitt admitted on the last afternoon. The come-along cables released and the whole structure held. Silent. Plumb. Patient in a completely new way. I've looked at that lean my whole life. It's like watching a man you knew stooped over stand up tall at his own funeral. He built it crooked for 30 years so nobody would look too close, Della said. I figure he'd forgive me for straightening it now that they already have. She had a man come with a lift and a sprayer after that. She had him scale it clean of 40 years of rust, down to bright galvanized steel. Then she stood at the base with a can of the old paint colour, matched as close as the hardware store could manage. White against silver. She painted the first 3 letters herself, before her arm gave out, and she let the hired man finish the rest. Tall enough to read from the river road, same as it always had been. The same words her grandfather had painted decades ago, before anyone alive now remembered him young. Hollis Hartwell Seed and Grain. And Wade came out to the bottoms one more time that summer. Alone this time. No penny-coloured truck. No Reardon. No black sedan trailing behind. He came in an older, dustier vehicle Della didn't recognise. He parked it well back from the house, the way a man parks when he isn't sure he's welcome. And he stood at the fence the way Pruitt had stood at it the first night, hat in his hands. Della came out onto the porch and didn't come down the steps. I lost the house on Maple, Wade said. No preamble. None of the warmth he'd worn like a coat every other time she'd seen him. Bank took it in March. I'm renting a place on the other side of town now. Small place. Fits what I've got left, which isn't much. I heard, Della said. I imagine you did. He turned his hat over once in his hands. I came out here to say I was wrong. Not just about the deal, about the dollar, about laughing at that table, about every bit of it. Going back years, if I'm honest. And I'm trying to be honest now because I've got nothing left to protect by lying. He looked past her at the silo, standing straight and clean and freshly lettered against the summer sky. Daddy built that for you. And I mocked it in the same room where he'd already made his choice. And it turns out he made the right one. I've spent 30 years telling myself I was the good son, because I was the one who stayed close, and he was the one who left. I wasn't the good son. I was just the one standing closest when there was something to take. Della let the quiet sit a while, the way she'd learned to let it sit. And Wade stood there and took it. He didn't fill the silence with more warmth, which was itself a kind of change in him. I'm not going to pretend the last 6 months didn't happen, she said finally. You let a room laugh at me. You tried to sell land you'd already lost the right to sell, and you'd have taken my signature on something worthless if I hadn't climbed a silo and found out different. I'm not going to hand you back what you tried to take. I'm not asking you to. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life the way you've spent yours, either. Holding a grudge like it's a mortgage I've got to keep paying down. She came down one step. Not all the way, but one. You want to come to Sunday dinner sometime, the kind where you actually sit and listen instead of talking over the table. You're welcome to. Not this Sunday. Maybe not for a while, but the door's not locked to you the way you seem to think it is. Wade nodded, once, and something in his face came apart the way Reardon's had at the signing table. Only slower, quieter, without an audience to perform for. That's more than I earned. Probably, Della agreed. Grandpa used to say the same thing about people, though. That most of what keeps a family together isn't earned. It's just given, and you hope the other person does something with it eventually. She looked at him a moment longer. Don't waste it twice, Wade. He didn't answer that. He just put his hat back on and walked to his car, slower than he'd come. Della watched him go, and she felt something in her chest ease slightly. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not yet. But the loosening of a hand that had been closed a long time. That same summer, she started something. She never quite decided to start a tradition, but that's what it became. A standing Sunday habit. She invited Adele and Faye Pruitt out to the farmhouse the first Sunday in June. She cooked a chicken in the kitchen that finally had both power and water pressure worth bragging about. She set the table with 4 chairs, though only 3 people came. She couldn't bring herself to set it for 3 and leave the 4th place empty on purpose, not with the ghost of every Sunday she'd once driven 40 minutes, each way still sitting somewhere in her chest. You don't have to keep doing this every week, Pruitt told her the 3rd Sunday running. He was working on a second helping of green beans, the ones Faye had brought from her own garden. I know I don't have to, Della said. Without meaning to, she was echoing the same words Curtis Vance had said to her back in the spring. I spent 2 years driving out to read seed catalogues to a man who couldn't see anymore. I did it because somebody ought to show up, even when there's nothing in it for them. You drove out to a fence my first night here. You told me the truth about a smell of welding smoke you couldn't explain. You could have kept it in your craw and let me sell the place unknowing. You didn't. I figure I owe a chicken dinner or 2. That's not owing, Faye said, mild, buttering a roll. That's just family. Sometimes it takes a body a while to notice they've got some. By late summer, the word around Cane Hollow had turned all the way over on itself. That's how it goes in small towns. Fast and total, and a little embarrassed at how wrong it had been the first time. Folks had once driven past the leaning silo and said, "That's the Hartwell place. Shame about it." Now they drove past a straight, freshly painted grain bin. It was lettered Hollis Hartwell Seed and Grain. And now they said something closer to, "That's the granddaughter's place." She turned it clean around, didn't she? Laline Boyd told the story at church more than once. She embellished it a little more each telling. The girl who walked into her Register of Deeds office with raw hands and a beaded glasses skepticism. The girl who asked to see a book nobody else had thought to ask about in 30 years. Reardon's development group never came back to the county. Marcus Feld's people gave up too. Once they were satisfied there was nothing left to collect from Wade beyond what the bank had already taken, they closed their file. They moved on. Off to whatever farm in whatever other county was about to make the same mistake somebody there hadn't made yet. And the 80 acres in the Caney Fork bottom stayed exactly what Hollis Hartwell had quietly arranged 3 years before he died. Della's. Recorded. Sealed. No longer anyone's to argue over at any table, in any lawyer's office, ever again. She did not in the end become a farmer in any grand or storybook sense. The soil in the bottoms had turned too wet for corn, a long time before she was born. Pruitt had told her that first night at the fence. And she wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make the ending tidy. Instead, she leased half the acreage to a soybean cooperative 2 counties over. They specialised in wet bottom ground. The rent was modest and steady. It came in quarterly, and it covered the farm's taxes and then some. She turned the farmhouse into what it had once been meant to be, a home instead of a museum of grief. She painted the kitchen a pale yellow. Her grandmother had apparently always wanted that and never gotten it, according to Faye, who remembered such things. And she turned the silo into something her grandfather could never have imagined. Straightened, repainted, finally worth looking at instead of pitying. He couldn't have imagined it, but he'd have understood it instantly, because it came from the same instinct that had made him weld a strongbox in secret for 2 blind, half-paralysed years. He'd done that just to make sure the right person eventually climbed high enough to find it. She opened up the ground floor. That wide circular space had held 30 years of nothing but rust and pigeons. Now it was a small welding and machine repair shop. She hired Curtis Vance to run the floor full-time, a fair wage. The same-day cash policy she'd started that first Friday. Somewhere in the middle of that long, cold $43 winter, she'd decided something. The kind of poverty that teaches you to count coins twice should never be something you inflict on somebody else, not once you have the power not to. She kept one rule from the very beginning. She never had to write it down. Everyone who worked there learned it inside a week. Anybody who came through Cane Hollow and broke down on the Polk Road got helped. Farmer, trucker, stranger passing through. If it was a small fix, you looked at their vehicle for free. If it wasn't, you quoted them honest. No markup for desperation. No taking advantage of a person with nowhere else to turn. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. She'd watched Wade call a thing generous the very moment he was taking the rest of it for himself. And she'd decided a long time ago what she wanted. She'd been sitting in the cold on a silo floor with a strongbox in her lap. She decided she'd rather run a business that made less money, a business that cost her nothing to look at in the mirror. The first year the shop was open, a woman named Bethany Marsh came off the Polk Road. She had a stalled pickup and a toddler asleep in the back seat. No money for a tow. She was crying before she even got out of the truck. 2 places had already turned her away that week. They'd wanted $40 just to look at the engine. Curtis Vance found a corroded battery terminal in about 10 minutes. He cleaned it. He sent her on her way. And when she tried to press a 20 into his hand, he shook his head and pointed up at the tall white letters on the silo behind him. "Boss ladies rule," he said. "Small fix, no charge. Ask anybody in the hollow. It's the only rule that matters around here." Bethany Marsh told that story at the elementary school pickup line for a month. That's how stories travel in a town small enough to still trade in them. And somewhere in the retelling, it picked up a detail. The shop's owner had once been so poor she'd counted $43 on a car hood in the cold. That part was true. And she'd climbed a rusted silo alone in the dark to find her inheritance. Also true. By the time it looped all the way back around to Della, second-hand at the hardware store counter, it had grown a little taller, a little more legend than fact. The same way the silo's old lean had once grown taller in the telling, before she straightened it for good. She didn't correct the stories much. She'd learned something from her grandfather about that. You let a version of the truth do its quiet work in a town. So long as the important parts, the parts that mattered, stayed honest. What mattered was that a woman with a broken-down truck and a sleeping child got helped without shame. What mattered was that a shop stood where a joke used to stand, doing steady, useful work under a name 3 generations old. The exact wording of how the story got told at the school pickup line mattered a good deal less. By the second autumn, the co-op 2 counties over renewed her lease on the soybean acreage at a slightly better rate. They were impressed enough with how she'd kept the drainage ditches clear, impressed enough to ask if she'd consider leasing the rest of the bottoms too. She said she'd think on it. Those were the same 3 words she'd once used on Wade in her own front yard. Only this time she meant them plainly. No hidden card folded against her ribs. Pruitt's health had started to slow that second year. That's the way a man's health does after 40 years on a scale floor, and 70-some years altogether. And Della found herself driving out to his place on Wednesdays now too. Not just Sundays. She'd bring a casserole, or she'd just sit on his porch while Faye ran errands, the two of them talking about nothing in particular. The price of diesel, whether the Caney Fork would flood again come spring. Whatever a body talks about with someone they've come to love without ever quite deciding to. You didn't have to keep coming around this much, Pruitt told her once, late in that second autumn. His voice was thinner than it had been the first night at the fence. His eyes were just as sharp. I know, Della said. I've noticed that's usually when it matters most. He laughed at that. A real laugh. He reached over and patted the back of her hand once with his cured leather palm. It was the same hand that had steadied the ladder for her that first cold morning. Neither of them said anything else about it, because some things she'd learned a person shouldn't explain, even when they want to. You just let them sit in the room. The certified copy of the deed stayed in the strongbox under the farmhouse floorboards for a long while after the signing table. Then Della decided something. A thing that important shouldn't live under a plank where a house fire or a flood could take it in a single bad afternoon. So she had it professionally framed instead, alongside her grandfather's cracked reading glasses and the little brass-headed key. She hung the three of them together in the front hallway. Anyone coming through the door would see them first, before the pale yellow kitchen. Before anything else. Not to brag, just so the house itself would always remember, the way she intended to, exactly what it had taken, and exactly who had built the door. She thought sometimes about how close it had come to going the other way. She'd be standing in that hallway with a grocery bag still in her hand, thinking about it. If Pruitt hadn't stopped at the fence that first evening, if she hadn't had $11 left for a pry bar, if Wade's greed had been patient instead of desperate, if he'd waited past the bank's balloon note instead of rushing Reardon to the table before his own debts caught up with him. Her grandfather had built the door, but she was the one who'd had to climb and count and wait. She'd had to hold her tongue at a table where every instinct in her had wanted to shout. He'd given her the key. He hadn't been able to give her the patience it took to use it. That part, it turned out, she'd already had in her the whole time. Worn into her the same slow way water wears a channel into stone. 2 years of 40-minute drives nobody asked her to make. The cousins drifted back into her life. They'd once picked through the cardboard box for a pocket watch and a folded flag. Now they came back the way distant relations do, once there's something worth being distant relations to. A cousin named Priscilla had taken the china. She'd never once called to check on Della in the 2 years their grandfather lay dying. Then the news of the shop reached her, and she sent a long, warm text message, congratulating Della on everything working out, as if it had been luck, instead of 2 years of Sundays and a winter of $43. Della read it twice. She typed and deleted 3 different replies. Finally, she settled on a short one. Thank you. Glad you're well. She did not invite Priscilla to Sunday dinner. Some doors, she'd decided, a person gets to leave shut without it making them bitter. It was simply an accounting. The same kind her grandfather had kept in a strongbox for 2 silent years. Who had shown up and who hadn't. And she found she could hold that accounting without malice, the way you hold a ledger, not a grudge. Her mother had been long estranged, living 2 states over since before Della could properly remember why. She called once that winter. She'd heard some version of the story from Priscilla's side of the family, and she asked, carefully, whether there might be room in Della's life again. Room for a relationship neither of them had ever quite managed to build. Della sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment. She looked out at the silo standing straight and white-lettered against the early dark. Then she told her mother the truth, gently, the way her grandfather might have. I don't know yet, Della said. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I spent a long time being the only one who showed up for people in this family, and I'm still learning what it looks like when somebody shows up for me instead. Give me some time to learn it before you ask me to trust it. Her mother, to her credit, didn't push. She said she'd call again in the spring, and she did. By the following summer, they had started something, slowly. The kind of relationship built one honest phone call at a time, not one dramatic reconciliation. Della had come to believe that was really the only kind that lasted. The county held a small ceremony that second spring. Nothing grand, just the local paper, and a handful of Cane Hollow business owners, and a man from the State Agricultural Extension Office. It marked the shop's first full year of operation. And, unofficially, it marked the restoration of a landmark. Half the county had grown up measuring their directions by that silo. Someone from the paper asked Della a question, notebook out. What did she want people to take from the story? Was there a moral to it, the way there always seemed to be a moral wanted at the end of these things? She thought about it longer than the reporter expected her to. My grandfather used to say something, she said finally, that the difference between rich and poor isn't always the number in the account. Sometimes it's just who bothered to build you a door. She looked past the reporter, out at the silo catching the last low light of the afternoon. Tall and straight and lettered in white. The way it had been 60 years before anyone currently living in Cane Hollow was born. He built me one. Took him 2 years, half blind, one hand working. I just had to be the one who climbed high enough to find it, and stubborn enough not to sign it away to somebody who never earned it. The reporter wrote that down, mostly accurately. The story ran the following Thursday. It ran under a photograph of Della standing at the base of the freshly painted silo in her mustard scarf. Odell Pruitt was just visible at the edge of the frame, his hat in his hands. That's the way he'd stood at nearly every important moment of the whole thing, without ever once being asked to. Autumn came around a third time. By then the shop had grown enough that Curtis Vance had 2 men working under him, instead of none. Both paid the same fair, same-day wage Della had insisted on from the start, and the soybean lease had grown to cover the whole 80 acres. The rate finally let her stop counting coins on car hoods, though she still counted them out of habit some mornings. The way a person keeps a scar even after the wound has closed clean. She still drove the same rusted Corolla. The serpentine belt had finally been replaced. Curtis had insisted on doing it for free one slow Tuesday, and she'd learned, finally, how to let somebody give her something, without immediately needing to give something back in the same breath. It was the 3rd anniversary of the will reading. That date was fixed forever in her memory, the way certain dates fix themselves, whether you want them to or not. Della drove out to the Bottoms in the early evening, alone. It was the way she'd driven out that very first grey February afternoon, with $43 and a key and a pair of cracked glasses. Except this time the farmhouse had power in every room. The roof didn't leak. The silo didn't lean. She parked in the same weeds, a little less weedy now, and she sat looking at it through the windshield, the same way she had that first day. She sat there a long while before getting out. She let the engine tick down in the quiet, the way it had that first afternoon, and she thought about all the small, ordinary decisions that had stacked up, one on top of the other, into everything that came after. The decision to keep driving 40 minutes each way on a Sunday. Nothing waiting for her at the end of it, but an old man's voice and a stack of seed catalogues. The decision to take the cracked glasses instead of the pocket watch. The decision to trust a stranger at a fence instead of driving straight back to town and putting the whole 80 acres on the market herself, unopened. The way a person exhausted by grief might reasonably have done. None of those decisions had felt large at the time. Each one had felt like the smallest, quietest thing a person could do. It was only looking backward, 3 years on, standing in a yard that no longer belonged to anyone's joke, that she could see the truth. Each small thing had been load-bearing, the way a single weld holds up more than its size would suggest. Curtis had long since finished the day's work and gone home to his own family. The shop sat dark and locked at the base of the silo. Tools put away clean, the way she insisted. The only sound in the whole Bottoms was the caney fork running low and easy behind the sycamores, and a single dog barking somewhere off toward the Pruitt place, faint with distance. Della got out of the Corolla. She walked the long way around the farmhouse first, the way she sometimes did, checking the gutters out of old habit, even though Curtis had already checked them that week. She ran her palm along the porch rail she'd painted with her own 2 hands the first spring, feeling for splinters that weren't there anymore. Then she walked out past the shop to the silo itself. She let herself in through the same sheet steel door, though it swung easy on oiled hinges now, instead of fighting her shoulder the way it had that first freezing morning. Inside, the space was clean and dry. It smelled of machine oil now, instead of rust and pigeon droppings. Curtis's workbenches were lined along one curved wall. A single bare bulb hung from a cord, right where grey light used to fall through a gap in the roof cone. The ladder was still there, repainted but unmoved, bolted to the same curved wall it had always been bolted to, climbing up into space that was fully lit now instead of dark. She put her hand on the first rung. Out of habit, more than need. She felt the cool paint under her palm, instead of the flaking rust that used to bite through her gloves. And she climbed slow, the way a person climbs a thing they've climbed 100 times since, and no longer needs to be afraid of, though some part of her chest still tightened anyway at rung 6. At rung 7, the old fear living on in her body a little longer than the actual danger had. She reached the 9th rung and stopped there, the way she always stopped there now, an old habit worn as deep as any groove her grandfather had ever cut into a fence post. She laid her palm flat against it, feeling the smooth underside that didn't match the others. The same seam her fingers had found in the pitch dark 3 years before. Back then she'd had nothing but a stranger's voice, calling encouragement up from the floor below her. She thought about her grandfather in this exact spot, blind. One hand mostly useless. A hired boy waiting in a truck outside. An old man welding a message to a granddaughter he was certain would come looking one day. Certain enough to bet the whole shape of his last 2 working years on it. She thought about the word he'd used in his letter, the word that had settled under her ribs at Pickett's office table, and never quite left since. Proud. He'd written it twice, close together. The way a man writes a thing he wants to make sure lands. I'm proud of you. I was always proud of you. She said it out loud once quietly to the empty lit silo, the way she sometimes still talked to him, when nobody else was around to hear it and think it strange. I heard you, she said. It took me a while, but I heard you. Outside, the last of the evening light was going purple over the bottoms. It had gone that way that very first night, when Odell Pruitt's truck slowed on the road and stopped, when a careful, 40 years practiced door slam carried across the cold air. It carried to a porch where a broke, exhausted young woman was sweeping mouse leavings by the last of the daylight. She hadn't known yet. She hadn't known that the thing she'd been handed as a joke was about to become the realest inheritance anyone in that family would ever receive. She climbed back down the ladder slow, rung by rung, the way she always did now. She no longer counted them out loud, because she no longer needed to. She knew exactly where the 9th one was. She would always know exactly where the 9th one was. She locked the silo door behind her out of habit, though there was little left inside worth stealing, beyond a workbench and some hand tools. She walked back across the yard toward the farmhouse in the last of the light. A truck slowed on the road behind her. The careful, familiar rhythm of it told her who it was before she even turned around. Odell Pruitt's headlights swung into the drive a moment later. Faye's silhouette was visible in the passenger seat. Something covered in foil was balanced on her lap. Saw your car parked out here this late, Pruitt called through his open window, cutting the engine. Figured either you were in some kind of trouble, or it was the 3rd anniversary. And I couldn't for the life of me remember which. No trouble, Della said. Just remembering. Faye made too much cornbread again, Pruitt said. It was a lie he told at least twice a month. Della had long since stopped correcting it. She understood by now that it was simply how the old man said, I love you, and thought of you today, without having to use either word directly. Seemed a waste to eat it without company. She let them in. The 3 of them sat at the long kitchen table under a real electric light. Faye set out the cornbread and reheated the soup she'd apparently also brought, unprompted. It was the same soup Faye had shown up with that very first hungry week, 3 years before. Back when the power was still off and the roof still leaked. Back when nobody in Della's life had yet learned a certain thing. That showing up quietly, again and again without being asked, was its own kind of inheritance. The kind a person could actually keep. After they'd eaten, the Pruitts drove off into the dark. Their headlights bounced over the washboard road. Della walked through the house room by room, the way she did most nights before bed. It was an old habit. It had started the winter the power was out, when she checked by candlelight that nothing had shifted in the dark. It had simply never stopped. She turned on every light as she went, not because she needed them, but because she liked still. After 3 years, the particular sight of the farmhouse glowing from every window at once, visible clear out to the Polk Road. A lit thing, where there had once been only a dark and pitied shape the county drove past without slowing down. She went out to the porch one last time, before turning in. The mustard scarf still hung on its peg by the door, where she'd hung it that very first cold evening. She looked out at the silo standing straight and white-lettered against the last blue of the sky. Hollis Hartwell Seed and Grain. Legible even in the near dark, to anyone who knew to look, she thought standing there, about the word Wade had used at the will reading. The word that had started the whole thing rolling. Cheap. Always did like the cheap things, didn't you? He'd said, holding a watch he'd already priced for its gold, and meaning it as an insult, wrapped thin in something that sounded almost like kindness. She understood now. 3 years, and one straightened silo later. He'd had the word backward the whole time. She hadn't liked cheap things. She'd liked true things. The reading glasses over the watch, the key over the cash, the recorded deed over the loud offer. It had simply taken the rest of Cane Hollow 3 years to catch up. To catch up to a distinction she'd understood instinctively. The moment Pickett set that cardboard box down on the table, a car passed on the poke road below. Slow. A stranger's headlights sweeping briefly across the yard and the silo and the glowing farmhouse windows. Then it moved on, toward whatever business had them out this late. Della watched the lights go. 100 cars a day must have passed this same stretch of road for 30 years, all while the silo leaned there, unremarked. A joke the county told itself, without ever once climbing up to check whether the joke was true. She wondered, not for the first time, how many other leaning, dismissed, joked about things were scattered out there, across however many other counties, quietly holding something nobody had bothered yet to climb up and find. She hoped, whoever eventually did the climbing, that they had an Odell Pruitt of their own waiting at the fence. The dog 3 farms over had stopped barking. The Caney Fork ran on steady behind the sycamores, the same low, patient sound it had made the night her grandfather first stood in this yard. He'd stood there half-blind and failing in every way but the one that mattered, and he'd decided he would spend what strength he had left building a door instead of leaving a complaint. Della pulled her coat a little tighter against the last of the evening chill. Though she no longer needed a coat, 2 winters past, warm the way she once had. She stood a moment longer in the dark, looking at the only thing in the county that had ever truly been given to her, without a single string attached. She went inside and hung her coat on the peg beside the mustard scarf. Every window in the farmhouse stayed lit behind her, gold against the dark, all the way down the Polk Road.